Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus app. Comes on your phone. It looks like that. You just touch that one right there. And it opens up and you have a whole host of courses and lectures you can listen to. Hundreds of courses, thousands of lectures. You don't have to buy just one course anymore. You get all the courses for a monthly fee. When you sign up through my site, you get a free trial, and then it's just $10 a month for the first quarter, I think. And then it's an incredible product because instead of like grinding through a whole book or whole course, if you decide you don't like a lecture, it's boring, you skip to the next lecture, or you skip courses. So I was in the middle of listening to this George Orwell course. It's fantastic. About how all the trouble he had getting Animal Farm published. I had no idea. Anyway, but then I see, this pops up, coronavirus outbreak, what you need to know. Boom, I'm going to that one. I'm going to listen to that lecture on the way home today because, well, that's what everybody's talking about now. Okay, so for the deal, you get a free trial plus $10 a month. After that, you go to greatcoursesplus.com/salon. That's www.thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. My guest this week is Don't Burn This Book, Dave Rubin of the famed Rubin Report. His new book, again, is Don't Burn This Book, subtitled Thinking for Yourself in an Age of Unreason. Now, there's a concept. Of course, Dave and I have known each other many years, but I've always been a guest on his show, usually talking about a particular book. So it was kind of nice to flip the vector and have him on for his first book, which is really inspirational. I think a lot of his huge fan base are going to get highly motivated by this book. It's a part memoir of his life and how he left the left, as it were, raised in a secular Jewish home that was pretty liberal, and how that changed over the decades and how he left the left. What is he now? Well, he's a classical liberal, so he also talks in the book about the principles of classical liberalism, how that differs from conservatism and liberalism, or at least modern liberalism. So you'll hear all about that, as well as a lot of really super interesting personal stories of his. And so with that, I give you Dave Rubin. Welcome to the Science Salon podcast, the new book, Don't Burn This Book, which I love because, of course, it's a reference to free speech and free thought, but also to, what was it, Abby Hoffman's book, Don't Steal this book, or Don't Steal This Book, I forget.
Yeah, steal this book.
Yeah.
Well, first off, Shermer, I'm very excited to be with you because you've been on my show like 87 times. You've written something like 450 books. And finally, we get to flip the script and see if we can do it this way. So I'm very curious to see what's going to happen over the next hour.
Well, I love the book. It's a fun read and also very insightful to you. I mean, I've known you a long time, but there's a lot of stuff in the book I didn't know about. So it's part memoir. It's part, classical liberalism. I sort of see it as a sort of an expanded version of your two popular videos, Why I Left the Left and What is Classical Liberalism. I think those two combined have been seen like 20 million times or something. So it's nice to have, more details fleshed in because those videos are kind of short. So let's start with that. That is,
sure.
You kind of start with this, here's who I am and here's where I began and here's how I got to where I am. I think a lot of people, particularly a lot of your fans, themselves go through journeys like this. And one of the things of having a mentor, one of your last chapters, is to see, well, so this is doable. People go through this. I'm not alone. So in a part, I think I'm wondering, is that why you wrote the book, was sort of say, look, this is normal to go through these things, and here's what happened to me.
Yeah, that actually is almost all of it right there. It's like I could have wrote the Why I Left the Left book, or that the left's become regressive and not progressive. For the record, I think I only say the word regressive in the book once. I know it's a meme about me that I say the word all the time.
Yeah.
But I knew I didn't want to just dive into, I was a lefty and now I'm something else, whatever that may be. I wanted to show people that you can go through this process too, and that there's a bunch of us, and many of these people, and I think in some respects you are one of these people, that have evolved politically, and that when you evolve politically, particularly if you go from lefty to, say, more conservative or more libertarian, if you move right in any regard, that unfortunately the way the left in 2020 deals with you is by trying to destroy you. There's very few solid grounded arguments. There's not none, and there are some good actors. And I try to make that clear in the book, and I try to sit down with as many of those people as possible in this very room.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to show people was my experience of leaving the left is sort of unique in that it happened in front of everybody. But really what I went through in terms of people trying to destroy my career, having friends turn on me, the hit pieces that come out in BuzzFeed and HuffPo and Mother Jones and the rest of it, that all these things that are designed to do, and you've gone through them too, and of course Jordan Peterson's gone through them, and many of the people in our circles, what they're designed to do, it's not just that they want to silence me, as if I'm so dangerous in and of myself, or that any of us are so dangerous just by ourselves. It's that they want to signal to everybody else, the average person out there, who maybe just wants lower taxes or maybe doesn't believe in the entire welfare state as it's set up or the rest of it. They want to cow them into silence so that they can keep sort of expanding their power. That really is what it is. And I wanted to show people, yeah, you're going to take some hits. People are going to say awful things about you. Family members are going to turn on you and say things to you that you are not going to believe. All of those things, we know these things are going to happen, but somebody has to help lead us out of this. So that really was the idea behind the book. And truly, when I this is how I opened the book, but when I signed the deal, it was really the why I left the left book. And it was just going to be a sort of decimation of the left. And then I just thought, I've done that. And for you, a guy that's written now 16 books, it's like, the feeling, I think, of when you've sort of gotten through an idea in your head and then you kind of want to move past it. And for me, one of the hardest parts of writing this is how long I've now had to sit on these ideas, because I finished this book in July of 2019. And then, you got all the edits and then they hold it for a while. And right now we're in the middle of this Corona thing and the book's coming out on April 28th, but they wanted to delay it again because of that. And I said, no, we've got to get this thing out. I can't sit on these ideas anymore. I want to be done with them so I can start thinking about some other things.
Yeah, it's not a great time to have a new nonfiction book out right now that's not about pandemics.
I know. I should have put a little.
But life has to go on, and I think we should still keep producing content because people in isolation need to consume something. But I like the other thing I like about your book, sort of punctuating what you just said, is that it's not enough to be against something.
Yeah,
you have to be for something. So it's one thing to debunk the creationists, but what do you say? Well, evolution. Well, what about debunking the Holocaust? And what do we know about the Holocaust? And I think it was Ludwig von Mises that made this point in his work, Human Action, that begins by debunking communism and socialism, but then he says, it's not enough to debunk socialism and communism and show why it doesn't work. We have to explain why the system we believe in works. So here are the positive principles. So I was glad to see you don't just, sort of go to the negative and go, here's all the crazy stuff people have been saying, but here's what I stand for and here's why. So I want to go through all those, but first,
sure.
Because it's something of a memoir, part one, since you're only 40 something, you can do part two in another decade. But tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your parents were, what they were politically and religiously and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I was born in Brooklyn before it was cool to be born in Brooklyn.
Right.
I was born at Brookdale Hospital in Brooklyn in 1976. I was born on June 26th. So 8 days later, you know what happens in the Jewish faith. I got my bris. I had my bris on July 4th, 1976. That's the 200-year anniversary of America. So maybe there was some reason that I was going to really fall in love with this country, putting aside the religious part of it for a second. Anyway, first couple of years in Brooklyn, and then my parents, and I talk about this in the book, my parents, my dad especially, who grew up sort of middle to lower middle class after his parents were completely lower class and grandparents before that, came from Eastern Europe. My dad sort of accomplished the dream, which was to move out to the suburbs. So I grew up in Long Island. We were middle to probably upper middle class, although there were a lot of people in my high school that were really rich. So I always thought we were poor, which is a weird thing. Like we weren't poor. I had Nintendo. I had the things that kids wanted. But, you don't really realize all those things when you see friends that have nicer cars and bigger houses and all that stuff. But I would say I had a very decent upbringing. There was no major drama. My parents are still married 45, now I think 47 years later, have a brother and a sister. Pretty functional household. There was no major drug problems, no major, no abuse or anything like that. Like just sort of a functional life, which in a weird way is a hard thing to talk about because, we live in a time where, if you were abused or if you grew up poor or whatever that perceived oppression, and sometimes it's a legitimate thing, of course. If you have that to hold on to, then people love your story. But if you have a story of, I had two parents and we had our struggles but we were basically okay and my mom cooked for us and stayed home when the kids were young and didn't work till later, but my dad busted his butt. And, I talk about it in the book. He took the Long Island Railroad 2 hours every day, five days a week for over 40 years. That's 2 hours. That's 2 years of his life to commute to New York City on that train. And it's not the most pleasant experience in the world, just so that he could give us a better life than he had. And that's what I was trying to pay forward here. So grew up culturally Jewish. And I talk about this, that, within I think the Jewish sort of framework of things is constant debate. If you have 4 Jews at a table, you have 5 opinions. Right. It's a constant push and pull. So I never grew up around like, you're arguing about something and then suddenly people don't talk to you anymore. My family, we would at every holiday, whether it was Thanksgiving or Passover, it was like we were arguing over everything. 30 people at a big table, everybody screaming, yelling, arguing. And then kind of dessert gets served and everybody just resets. There was never anybody holding a political grudge against anyone else. There were internal family grudges, you know what I mean? Like old fights from decades before. But we always let that stuff go. And I didn't realize it really until I was writing the book, that idea, I think, is what caused me to be a pretty decent interviewer, that I really can sit across from people that have beliefs that are completely counter to mine and not really judge them. I might think they're wrong and I might want to find out why they think that, but I don't really hold it against them. Now, somebody might have a truly odious belief that I wouldn't be happy with, but even that, I wouldn't kick them out of my studio. I wouldn't kick them, off Skype or something like that. So I would say my childhood was pretty decent. I went to SUNY Binghamton, which is a state school in New York. And, didn't get into crazy debt and then started doing stand-up and somehow ended up where I am right now,
Well, now were your parents, they were secular Jews, essentially, not really religious.
I mean, we did Shabbat every Friday night and, went to temple probably once a week and then on the big high holidays. Yeah. But, it's a weird thing. And I think a lot of people that I think, are in the sort of free thinking circles, there's many of them from Steven Pinker, Sam Harris, many of them come from culturally Jewish backgrounds where to be a free thinker, actually, to think for yourself is very embedded in the Jewish perspective. So that actually, I'm sure we're going to talk about it later, but that sort of does lead me to my conclusion on the religious stories. Which I know you and Peterson have a difference on.
Well, sort of. I don't know. I've been kind of thinking that through a little bit. We can talk about that later, maybe. But
sure.
This idea that traditional cultural heritage matters. I just had Brian Greene on the podcast. He's an atheist, but also raised secular Jew, and that when his father died, just the cultural tradition that Jews go through when somebody dies, he said was just so deeply meaningful to me. I needed that. It made a huge difference. And, and the joke I made was, so something like the Seinfeld Festivus for the rest of us with the metal pole, that was invented last week, that's not going to do it. Right. You can make up a story, last week, but it's that long traditional history and culture that gets carried forward generation after generation. And the sense I got with your book is you're taking it, pushing it a little bit forward too.
That's exactly it. I'm trying the best I can to do that. In this room, we had that debate about belief and morality and God with you and Dennis Prager and me. It was really a debate between you guys, and I just moderated. But I do believe that there's these time-tested practices, traditions, beliefs that they come with all sorts of baggage. There's no doubt about it. But I've just come to the belief that over generations, over time, they're the best things to keep us sort of anchored in something functional, which I know that even for my most secular friends like yourself, your belief in the individual and individual rights and equality, I actually think is rooted more in that than I think it's rooted in exclusively Enlightenment values, because there's a whole history of thousands of years before the Enlightenment. So this has been this ongoing debate about, did this all sort of start at the Enlightenment? And I just don't accept that. But just to sort of bring it back to where you started, I think for whatever reason, because belief isn't such a core, absolute necessity to being Jewish, I think that's allowed more Jews to be sort of culturally Jewish, like the Seinfeldization, let's say, of being Jewish, while completely being free thinkers and secularists and not wanting to convert anybody or force their beliefs on anybody else. That's just a different thing than I think some of the other monotheistic religions have.
Yeah, so most secular Jews lean politically left. Were your parents fairly liberal?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a family of Democrats, mostly. I mean, it was mostly Democrats.
Yeah.
But when I say that, see, this is where the shift now that we're seeing is so stark. Because if you were a Democrat in the 80s, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I mean, a JFK Democrat, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
That is 180 the opposite, complete polar opposite of what Bernie Sanders says.
Right.
So if Bernie Sanders is what the future of the Democrats is, if AOC is the future of the Democrats, the squad, et cetera, well, that has nothing to do with old school Democrats. That has nothing to do with liberalism. And that's the case that I'm making in the book, that liberalism, which is about individual rights and laissez-faire government and, the light touch of government when you need it. But beyond that, all the government, I believe, can do in a functional way is to basically get out of our way. And then when we start infringing on other people's rights, when we start infringing on other people's property, the government has to do something. And then we can always get into the little thing that we've talked about, I think, the first time I interviewed you, then what really is the difference between a classical liberal and a libertarian? Because where is that line where suddenly you say, okay, we need a little bit more government? But I would say my family basically were Democrats. And I think right now, my parents and most of my family is going through much of what I've been screaming about for these last couple of years, which is the Democratic Party of today is a leftist collectivist party. That is not a compliment to the right. And I'm happy to talk about conservatives and Republicans if you want to. But I think it takes a lot of people a long time to break out of when you know something. I'm a Democrat. I'm a Democrat. It's a thing that I am. Those are the good guys. Well, then time goes by, and what you may realize is it's just a shell, but what's underneath it isn't so good. And that's what I think a lot of people are waking up to these days.
Yeah, that's we're recording this right after that story came out. I think it was yesterday that 15% of Bernie supporters are not going to vote for Biden. They're going to vote for Trump. Yeah. Well, no Republican would ever do this. They would look at that and go, "Are you out of your mind? We're voting for our team. That's it."
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things there, right? So it's like, part of the Bernie thing is just so against the system, and this idea that we should just burn the system down, that it's like, all right, if it can't be our guy, we'll vote for Trump because he's just a complete wrench in the whole thing. So there's some element of that. I think the other element is that we've all sort of come to know now what was just sort of an unspoken rumor for years, which is that the DNC is just deeply, deeply corrupt. We know these are facts, that they basically rigged it against Bernie last time. We know that Donna Brazile, who was the head of the DNC, was giving Hillary Clinton debate questions and all of these things. And it's like, I think enough. Look, I have all sorts of problems with Bernie's ideas, and I think he's really confused. And I think, as I say all the time now, it's like he will be destroyed by the very ideas that he has helped propagate. Because at the end, he's going to be a failure. He's not going to be the nominee. And the progressives of tomorrow will have to take him out. He'll be an unsuccessful old white guy. That's sort of what he is in through their lens. And they're going to have to take him out. And it'll be the just rewards for sort of what he's brought on all of us. But watching people try to grapple through all this and go, look, I disagree with AOC on pretty much everything, but she did get one thing right. Biden and Bernie shouldn't be in the same party. I don't know what Biden is anymore, right? It's very hard to say. Is he an old school Democrat? He'll also tell you at the LGBT Equality Forum, he said that prisoners shouldn't go to jail based on their birth gender. It should be whatever gender they identify with. I mean, you're going to have a lot of male rapists in women's prisons. This is true.
Right.
So I don't know what he is, but the point is, whatever that version of a Democrat is, That has nothing to do with what the new sort of socialist thing is. And they shouldn't be in the same party. And I think one of the reasons that conservatives are kind of doing okay right now is there is a healthy push and pull, I would say, and tug between a more conservative view of the world and a more libertarian view of the world. I mean, look, Rand Paul, who is as libertarian as we're probably ever going to get in the United States, one of the few senators that I actually respect, he's one of Trump's biggest advocates.
Right.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing. So the Republicans seem to, because they basically believe in the Constitution as the unifying principle. They don't always act that way, but they basically do. I think they have sort of a healthy tent, roughly. The left at this point, because they don't really know what is the cohesive thing bringing them together. I want state power. I want more state power. That disconnect, I think, is causing all sorts of problems.
Yeah, and over the last, say, half century or so, it seems like the Democrats have become ever more splintered over smaller and smaller points. Like, I disagree with you on health care, point number 1C. Therefore, we are enemies. Whereas the right, they seem much more unified. I just recorded a podcast with Catherine Stewart, her book, The Power Worshippers, about the Christian nationalists and the extent to which they go to get their guys elected, even if they can't stand him. So this is the, why do 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, the least evangelical Christian ever? Well, because he's going to get us the judges we want. And that's going to help us overturn Roe v. Wade, which is what we want. So I'm going to hold my nose and I'm going to pull the handle for this guy I can't stand, because down the line in decades, this is going to matter. And I think what you're saying is Democrats are just not that organized.
Well, I don't know that it's not that they're so not that organized as much as they get stuck in the narcissism of small differences. They've somehow, and this also is what sort of shifted me on some of the belief and religious stuff, is when I think when you remove all of that and you think that you can just operate on a completely secular system. And by the way, I've said this to you a million times. When I say this, I mean this at a macro level, not a micro level. And I even I think I mentioned you by name in the book when I'm talking about this, that at a micro level, atheists, completely secular people can be the most moral and often probably are far more moral than many believers. I have absolutely no doubt about that you are a moral, decent human, that Sam Harris is a moral, decent human. All of my friends that I've had here, Peter Boghossian and the rest of it. At the macro level, I don't think it can kind of work. And the reason for that is when you remove something that's outside of us, I think what you end up left with is what the left is stuck with, which is however you kind of feel about anything on any given day feels like it's morally right. I think that's why Ben Shapiro's line about facts don't care about your feelings really took off. Because the left gets stuck in that narcissism of what you just said, healthcare, chapter 3, subsection B, and if you don't agree with me, what are you? You're evil. So they oddly use the language of mechanisms of religion while also saying that they hate religion. And it's taken me a long time, and I don't even know that I've fully worked this through. I think all of us sort of grapple with this. It sounds like what you said before. You're seeing some value, and Brian Greene is seeing some value in these ancient things. Does that mean you believe in something that you can't prove, or believe that there's this guy watching you? I don't think this guy's watching me, but that the set of ideas that were churned through the ages has given us something good, and that's what I'm afraid of throwing away in the name of here's a great example. It's like they push for $15 minimum wage all the time, right? So Bernie, $15 minimum wage. Now, there's a million economic reasons it doesn't make sense, and we know about automation, and you're going to replace all these people with iPads and blah, blah, blah. But then Rashida Tlaib comes out, and she's even further to the left of Bernie, and she says $20 minimum wage. And it's like, well, okay, if you've chosen $15, which is just an arbitrary number, but it makes you feel good. Well, now she says 20, and then why shouldn't it be 20? Why shouldn't it be 25? And if you don't agree with me, well, you're as evil as the guys who say it should be $8 or there should be no minimum wage. So I think that's why they get caught in something, because they don't take any value in something outside themselves. And it's a weird position for me to argue. This is not a position that I would have argued a couple of years ago.
Yeah, in a way, the previous statement you made about this collection of ideas and institutions that have been hard won over thousands of years, trial and error by religious leaders and politicians, ideologists, and so on. That's kind of a Burkean conservatism That is, Edmund Burke was supportive of the American Revolution, but critical of the French Revolution. Mainly because the French Revolution was throwing away everything, whereas the American Revolutionists was going, let's keep the things that work, let's get rid of things that don't work. And here's our list, which they listed right there in the Declaration of Independence. Whereas the French, let's just throw the whole thing over, including the calendar, all religious institutions and so on. And Burke was saying, well, now, wait a minute. Some of these things have been tried and tested and they work pretty good. We should keep some. And I think that's what you're arguing here.
Well, that's very much what I'm arguing, and that's what I lay out in the book. I mean, look, in the Constitution, in the Declaration of Independence, we talk about God-given rights. Most of these people were believers, and at the same time, they were calling for a separation between church and state. They had a real understanding that when they were in the old country, when they were in England, the king was God, in effect. The king gave them freedom, and the system that they instilled here was not that the government gives you freedom. It is your inalienable right that you are free. It is your birthright as a human being that you are born free. The state can come in and take your rights, right? It can imprison you. It can stop your free speech, the litany of things that the state can do, but that you're born free first. And that comes from something before us. So our founding documents, I mean, these are, I think, the greatest political documents that have ever been written. They were written by imperfect people. They were written by people who were slave owners, many of whom didn't want women to vote. I mean, we can go through the examples there, but over the course of time, we freed more and more and more people. And I think that the lens of classical liberalism, if you were to tell me that there is any law that exists today in the United States that stops a lawful citizen of the United States from doing whatever they want that anyone else can do, and it's based on some sort of immutable characteristic, gender, sexuality, color of skin, ethnic origin, et cetera, well, the classical liberal view would say that is wrong and that has to be corrected. And that is what we've systematically done so well. Could we have done it quicker? Sure. Is hindsight 2020? Of course it is. Are there still places that we could probably find some little areas where we could expand individual rights? Probably, not much actually, but there's probably something, and I would always fight for those things.
Yes, well, the gay rights revolution that climaxed in 2015, what's next? Well, animal rights, I guess, or robot rights or something like this. I don't know. Yeah, we've done pretty good, yet there's still sort of small details to iron out. Let me just punctuate what you said with a couple of quotes. This from James Madison in his Federalist Paper number 51, probably the most famous one. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So here's the rub. Once you set up a government that, and you, as you described it so adequately, the soft touch, well, then the touch gets, like 1% firmer and then 2% and then 10%. And then all of a sudden it's 100% bigger than it was. This is always the rub with setting that up. There seems to be almost like a law of nature of this, constant growth, bureaucratic growth of fiefdoms that politicians, because these are humans with jobs.
Humans with jobs.
And I want to keep my job.
They want to keep their job. And also the way our government works right now, this, government just gets a budget because it's all imaginary money in effect. And what do you do? If you're at a government agency, if you're a small business, what do you have to do? You have to make more money than you spend. Otherwise, you will go out of business. But in a government contract, every year you get a budget and you have to hit that budget or exceed it because otherwise they're going to cut your budget. So everyone in government is actually pushed to spend as much money as possible, which is completely the reverse of what you were just laying out there. And that's why it's so interesting that, unfortunately, because of social distancing and everything going on with Corona, we're doing this over Skype. But one of the things that I'm seeing right now that's actually I'm quite enthused over is that we're hearing people talk about states' rights for the first time in a long time now, that governors, you can't do everything just by a state when it comes to a pandemic. Of course you can't, because diseases travel, people travel. I mean, there's all that. But suddenly realizing that the giant federal monolith can't do everything, I think is a wonderful outcome of all of this. We're not on the outcome side yet, but when we get through of all of this, which we will, I think a lot of people are going to be thinking back. All of these people that for the last 3 years have been screaming Trump is Hitler, they're the same people that want the federal government to do everything right now. And it's like, wait a minute. You think the guy's Hitler, you think all his supporters are Nazis, and also you demand that we give him more power in times of crisis. And I think it's becoming so obvious to people that hopefully a book like mine is going to actually make sense to them. Because if you think this guy's awful, well, then one of the exchanges you have to make as a free person is when I vote for somebody, I don't vote for somebody because they can fix all my problems. What I'm really voting for is I want the guy who's going to have the least to do with my life. And I think, unfortunately, what has happened now with sort of the Bernie crew is they think, oh, the state, if we can just get our guy in, and if we can just give him enough power, he can sort of perfect the human condition. Everyone will have health care. Right. Everyone will be free. Everyone will be happy. This is sort of like a combination of Obama, like everyone's going to be happy, hope and change, and Bernie, everyone's going to be safe and healthy, something like that. And it's combined itself into something that's really toxic. We can't create a perfect system because we are not perfect. I think the best we can do is create a system that protects our rights equally, and then hopefully our better angels allow us to keep expanding those rights as time goes on.
Yeah.
And if we have to talk about robot rights and animal rights, we can do that.
Well, so maybe another way to say it is you didn't lead the left left you, or the left liberalism or classical liberalism or something.
I believe that's a Ronald Reagan quote right there.
Yeah. So, well, let's get into the details then. What does a classical liberal / libertarian or whatever? The labels are always problematic. I mentioned Burkean conservatism. I suspect many centrist liberals will go, yeah, I agree with Burkean conservatism, but I don't call myself a conservative because of those right-wing nationalists that, whatever. And then so the labels are always problematic. But so
absolutely.
So you have sections in the book: free speech, drugs, abortion, economics, foreign policy, family and children, racism, homophobia, misogyny, wage gap, guns. I mean, you hit it all. It's great. I love that.
Yeah, we just threw them up.
So, and it's not that, we're expecting listeners to agree with you, but what's the case, the classical liberal case for, let's just start with drugs, for example.
Yeah. Well, so all of these, by the way, one of the things that I really liked about writing a book is it's one thing when I sit and I talk to people or I interview people or I tweet, and you can just kind of get an idea out quick, you get feedback, and it is what it is. But when you're writing a book, I don't have to tell you this. I mean, you really have to examine what you think about in the deepest possible way. So the way I lay out the drugs thing, I mean, the first thing I say in the chapter is basically, I've done most drugs. I've done most of it. I haven't done all of it. I don't do them anymore. I smoke pot occasionally, once or twice a week. I watch The Simpsons and I fall asleep. That's pretty much it. And I like red wine. The argument I make is, look, first, using wine as the example, if you're for alcohol being legal, which virtually everybody is, then it really doesn't make any sense to say that marijuana should be illegal. So first, let's just deal with marijuana, and then we'll talk about the other drugs. I mean, look, there's a gajillion, and I lay out some of the stats, the amount of people that die from drunk driving, the amount of diseases alcoholism causes, and all that most domestic violence, at least one of the person is under the influence of alcohol. We can unpack all of that stuff, but the simple fact is, marijuana, none of that exists. I mean, there's just no statistics to support that if you're smoking marijuana, you're violent, that you're doing criminal activity, any of those things. Now, you may lay on the couch, you may be lazy, all of those things. And we have to honestly talk about that too, right? Because we glorify pot through the media in a way. And I'm not actually here to sell it on anyone or glorify it in any way. George Carlin had a great line about pot, which is basically, it's the only drug that one day you're like, I don't want any more of this. Like you actually kind of, many people I think grow out of it or they go from being potheads or dependent on it to the occasional weekend puff or just to relax at night or something like that. That I would view though. So first I talk about the hypocrisy of, which is very strong, by the way, in the conservative side of things. They're for legalization of alcohol, but marijuana is somehow the devil's, thing. And that's really bad. Okay. So I first call that out. What I would say, though, compared to other drugs, and here's a great example, so I'm glad that you started with this, where I would say classical liberalism and libertarianism actually do diverge. So the libertarian thing, if you fully believe that everyone can do whatever they want, as long as it's not infringing on someone else's property or their life themselves, well, then it's very, very hard to make an argument that all drugs shouldn't be illegal, right? You would say everything should be legal and everyone can do whatever they want. This is where I would say the light touch of government does come into play. I don't want people smoking crack and meth and doing heroin and all that. I don't want to make it any easier to get. Now, of course, even saying that, that's littered with inconsistencies because we know you end up creating black markets for things and all sorts of stuff. But this is where I would say the government has to have some minor responsibility. Now, I don't want, if there's a heroin addict on the corner, I don't want that person just thrown in jail and throw away the key and now let that person be on the government's dole forever. We then have to figure out, well, what is your responsibility as a society? If you say to a person, you can't do this, you can't do meth, but now somebody does do it, they get it illegally and they do it. Well, maybe we can put the person who sold it in jail. I think that is probably fine. I would say not probably. I do think that's fine. But for the user, the person who got hooked, do we want to just put them into the system? And especially if you're a limited government guy and a low taxes guy, you're the one that's going to be footing the bill. So this is a place where light touch of government, and I could see, then we could really whittle this argument down into, okay, well then should MDMA be legal and medicinal mushrooms, which I would say should be legal. And, we could whittle every little drug down to where we're going to go on this. And that's where a healthy argument is, by the way.
Yeah.
So that would be my basic take on the drug situation, is that you don't want to be locking people up for doing drugs. I think we should probably figure out a way to free a lot of people who are in because of using drugs. The selling drugs is a different thing. But we all know that the war on drugs was a failure. I don't think you can legalize everything. So this is going to piss off my more libertarian people. And that's okay.
Well, aren't there some Northern European countries, maybe Norway, that are, fairly left in government, but they've legalized drugs and then spend the money on rehab and addiction research and getting these people back up on their feet. I don't think that's necessarily just a libertarian argument. The other problem with the pure libertarian argument, because it has to do with the underlying theme here, which is, if it's two consenting adults, then what's the harm? Okay, so you take something like prostitution or polygamy. So here, I used to, in my libertarian days, think, well, yeah, that should be totally legal. But then when you look at it, each of them carefully, in like polygamy, these are young girls, like 5 years old, 7 years old, raised to believe, well, this is what I'm going to do. And by the time they're 15 and they're 16, married off to some old fart, they don't know any different. Their brains aren't even developed until their early 20s to make, rational decisions. So there, the light touch of government seems like they're not actually free, consenting adults making choices. And same thing with prostitution. So many of these young girls are addicted to drugs. They're controlled and beaten by their pimps. They're not making, economic choices. They're kind of forced into this lifestyle. And there I can see an argument, kind of a conservative argument. There we need a stronger touch of government.
It's interesting because you could even take that a step further. So I agree with your premise there. But the next step, which is an even more conservative argument that I sort of lay out later in the book, which is that actually the nuclear family does have value. That having everyone marry 5 people, having everyone do whatever they want at all times, even for a real liberty person, probably is not the best way to defend liberty over time. There's a reason you're married and have a small child. There's David, I say this in the book. I had never said it publicly before, but David and I are in the process of having kids. That's the next step in life to create something timeless. The conservatives would love two libertarian, half believers, half non-believers to be saying something like that. But I think it becomes an inevitable truth that we all get faced with at some point.
Yeah, I think it's good to emphasize that we're talking about on average. It's better to be,
of course.
Because there's plenty of examples.
I say that in the book. I say that in the book. I say it many times. You can be single and very happy and fulfilled and have purpose. You can be an atheist and be happy and have purpose and all those things. I always try to qualify it because, of course. But when you're trying to write a book like this, it's like you have to take sort of themes that overall, I think, basically work.
I think the far left or liberal or progressive, whatever word we want to use, objection is that the far right, maybe, or the Christian right, tends to emphasize that if you don't get married, if you're not in a heterosexual two parent family, you're not as good, or it's not as moral, or there's more problems or whatever. And they kind of, the imposition of a moral value on somebody else seems illiberal.
So as long as they don't try to put that into law, as long as you are not punished for not living the lifestyle that they so choose or so believe to be best, then I don't really have a problem with that. I can tell you that in the last year, the amount of evangelical Christians that email me to say, Dave, I never thought some New York gay whatever was going to be the guy that I find most interesting politically, but you don't speak down to me, you don't judge me, all of that. I spoke at Liberty University. It's the largest evangelical college in the country, in front of 14,000 people. Now, when I was on tour with Jordan, the largest theater that we did all over the world was I think 6,500. This was 14,000 people. It felt like a true political rally.
Wow.
There I am sitting next to Jerry Falwell Jr.
Wow.
And I'm sure in your day you've debunked many of the things that his dad has put out there. Okay. But not only did they know everything about me, including, and I'm sure we'll get to it, that I am pro-choice, right? That's a bigger no-no for these guys than gay.
Yeah.
But I spoke, got a wonderful ovation. I wandered around campus all day long, shaking hands, taking pictures with kids. And yes, some people did say to me, by the way, I pray for you. And I don't know if they meant I'm praying for you, like pray the gay away, or pray to, become a Christian or something like that. Maybe they were. But what I can tell you is I have consistently found these people to be open and decent and tolerant. And our friend Peter Boghossian, I know he's going through a version of this, watching sort of a lot of the atheist movement has sort of eaten itself because of social justice. And suddenly guys like you and Pete are being welcomed by groups that perhaps you thought were completely against you. And suddenly they're going, hey, we're not so bad. Why don't you come and talk to us? And I know it's always a thrill for you to engage in those conversations. So there's a lot of interesting things happening right now.
Yeah, my worst enemies are far left atheists, the atheist plus crowd. The
right.
Plus is social justice. And it really splintered after Dawkins' 2006 book, The God Delusion. First, it splintered along the lines of how militant are you? And if you're not militant enough, then you're not a true atheist, So
I mean, Michael, but you see, that's exactly what I said before about the $15 minimum wage thing and that narcissism of small differences. Because if you remove some sort of thing outside of yourself, you're left with how you feel about something, and that's it. And then, someone comes in and says something else, and even if it's a better idea, then they're suddenly better than you, and someone can't be better than you. You're you, so you have to take them down. So that thing, and by the way, when I started waking up to all of this, and I spoke at the Reason rally, and that's really when I first met you and Sam and all these guys, I was just seeing it as it was starting to fall apart. Yeah. And I think maybe that's also a little bit of where some of the beginnings of my ideas started coming from.
Yeah, that's kind of why I'm pushing Enlightenment humanism rather than secular humanism, because secular humanism historically has been a very politically left, liberal movement. And, they have a list of here's our planks in our platform, so to speak. And then it got to the point where if you don't check all 12 boxes, then you're out. You're not a humanist. It's like, well, wait, but I'm socially liberal, fiscally conservative. Nope, you're out. Okay, this is not good. This is like libertarians. They're never going to, get into power because they disagree with each other on everything and don't unite. Anyway, that's a separate issue. But I'm glad that, you had a good experience at Liberty. There are these Christian nationalists I referenced before, people that do want to impose the Christian value and worldview on other people through various techniques of these think tanks and nonprofits that are like Betsy DeVos and her school choice. It sounds good on the surface, but really a lot of these schools are religious schools, Christian schools, and they're trying to get government money to support these Christian schools because they want children to be raised under a Christian worldview. And
so there's a couple interesting things there. So first off, I think the more libertarian side of you, as a general rule, you're probably for school choice, right?
Yes, I would like parents to have,
if you could remove the religious part from it for a second.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So most of us that are liberty minded, and if you want parents to ultimately be able to have their children taught where they want, you want school choice. Now, what you're bringing up about that, then all of these religious schools, and by the way, it's not just Christian schools. I mean, there's Jewish schools that get government money then, and Muslim schools, and probably Quaker schools, and all sorts of stuff. Now that, I'm with you. There's a real problem there. Government and religion not supposed to have that much to do with each other. So if you can separate the idea of school choice from religion suddenly being pushed into curriculum,
Yeah.
then I'm okay with it. It's a really messy one, that one, because our public education system has become so corrupt and it's become so monolithic. The Department of Education, and it's like we've got this one giant group that is, we have 50 states, and people do, depending on where you live, you might need to learn different things differently if you live in a very rural community versus if you live in a big city. So I want as much choice as possible. How you separate that from, say, a parent that wants a more religious upbringing, and yet you also want school choice and you want to give maximum flexibility to the parent, it's a tricky one for sure. I mean, I think ultimately the best argument would be, okay, well, you still have to teach purely secular values in school. And if you want a religious upbringing, well, then that should be done after school or in the home or something else. That to me is the most sensible. I would need to know more about specifically how much money all these schools are getting, and are they teaching things that are actually counter to real American values and the Constitution at the same time? Like, are they really teaching them, this religious belief actually supersedes the secular belief, something like that?
Yeah. Well, some of them teach that America was founded on Christian values and not the real history, which is more of a deist perspective.
Yeah.
The founding fathers were, they weren't what we would call evangelical Christians, not even remotely close to that. But like Burke, they recognized the value of certain religious traditions. So, for example, one of the arguments Jefferson made was that, if we want to have a free people and a small government, then they have to have internal moral values. They have to be able to, police themselves, because we can't police everybody. The long arm of the law wasn't very long in 1776. So, there was that argument. And of course, I would agree with that. We should have internal moral values.
And by the way, when we just very quickly on Jefferson, when we talk about Jefferson, it's like, there is a movement to have, Monticello, his home taken down, and have all of, Mount Rushmore and all of these things with George Washington and all of our historic figures. And again, these are imperfect people who did wonderful, wonderful things. Thomas Jefferson was writing the laws that freed the slaves while at the same time owning slaves and having relations and probably a child with at least one. And by the way, they're very upfront about that. If you've ever taken the tour at Monticello, which I've done multiple times, I mean, they spend probably more of the tour talking about slavery than anything else that Thomas Jefferson did. You go to George Washington's house outside of in Virginia, and they talk mostly about slavery, and that when he died, I mean, this is a really fascinating thing. I don't know if you know this. When George Washington died, he owned slaves and his wife owned slaves.
Yeah.
His slaves were freed when he died. Hers were not.
Right.
So these were all people of their time who were inconsistent, but often trying to do things, by the way, much like Barack Obama, who ran against gay marriage the first time around.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure the progressives of 2040 are not going to look on that too kindly.
Yeah, and Hillary too. Both of them changed in 2011 or after 2011. Of course, when politicians are campaigning and saying things, you never know what they really believe and what they feel they need to say for their constituents. Okay, let's talk about abortion. That's another one of these hard ones. You have these essentially conflicting rights: the rights of the fetus, the rights of the woman. Conservatives, say, well, we believe in the sanctity of life, and life begins at conception, and therefore that trumps a woman's right to choose. But on the other hand, conservatives are supposed to be in favor of liberty, freedom, autonomy, and self-reliance, and so on. What about women's reproductive choices? How do you parse that one?
Yeah, so this was probably the hardest chapter to write, the hardest specific issue to write about. This is usually framed, if you watch cable news, if you're a Republican, you hate women, and if you're a Democrat, you hate babies, something like that.
Right.
And it's like, of course, this is not true. And we have to, if we can't just get past that, every meme out of the left is Republicans want to control women. They hate women. They want to control women. There's a lot of Republican women, by the way, and every meme out of the right is lefties want to kill babies because they're godless and blah, blah, blah. And it's like neither one of these things are true. What is true is it depends which value you hold higher in the world through whatever lens you look at the world through. So what I've ultimately decided here for years, and I've debated this with Ben Shapiro, I've been pro-choice my whole life. My parents were pro-choice, still are pro-choice. My feeling was that 20 weeks was an acceptable cutoff because at 20 weeks, they've proven that the fetus can feel pain. Now, that's a couple months into the pregnancy. And as Shapiro has said to me, well, Dave, if you're admitting it's a life at 20 weeks because it can feel pain, it's obviously a life at 19. And I actually have no argument against that. I cannot deny that. But what I chose at that point, and for most of the last few years where I've been discussing these things publicly, my feeling was you want to give maximum freedom to the living person who has rights here right now. And in this case, that's the mother. And then 20 weeks when that child can feel pain, it's slightly arbitrary because I'm picking pain as the point, which, by the way, now I think they've done some studies that it might even be a little earlier than 20 weeks to feel pain. So I was admitting sort of a slight, not quite an inconsistency, but a sort of a rift in the belief right there, that I was just sort of choosing something. What I've come to believe over the past year or two, as I've had more and more of these conversations, I don't know if you know Lila Rose from the Live Action Network, who's a pro-life advocate. So completely pro-life, obviously, from conception. I don't take that position either, but I've had interesting discussions with people like her. And my feeling now is 12 weeks, 3 months. At that point, you want to give, for those first 12 weeks, you want to give maximum choice to the woman. Now, we can debate all day long. When the sperm meets the egg, is that moment of conception, is that the beginning of life? Is it the blastocyst just a few days later? And by the way, I'm quite well versed in this now as we're dealing with fertility doctors
right.
and the rest of it.
Right.
So, and by the way, that also did help me frame a lot of this chapter because I'm quite literally in fertility doctors' offices. And, and they talk about selective terminations, which is their way of, in effect, saying abortions and all sorts of things, right? So this is not just some pie in the sky academic thing for me. This is something that I was living through as I was writing it. I think for 12 weeks, you have to give maximum choice to the woman. I am not denying the debate about when life begins. And we can have the religious debate about that. We can have the philosophical debate about that, conception, blastocyst, 3 weeks later, certain amount of brain development, all of those things. At 12 weeks, I think at some point you have to have a cutoff. And what I've realized is the 20-week cutoff, it's just too far. A first term, 12-week trimester abortion, that is a baby there. I believe that is a life, but what I'm trying to do is give people the roadmap to give maximum choice to that woman. And by the way, hopefully the man who had something to do with it as well, to do what they think is right. Now, if, by the way, after 12 weeks, you're going to force someone not to have an abortion, it's similar to an argument we were discussing earlier. Well, then does the state have a responsibility to help them? That's an interesting play, and a tough one for libertarians, by the way, because it's like, oh, well, we're going to use state power to stop someone from doing something they want to do. But now, actually, because we did that, do we have to help those people? Really great argument to have. That's a wonderful argument. What I would say beyond 12 weeks, that there are extreme medical circumstances that could pop up. If you found out that this child was going to have some sort of disease or long-term disability, that it would never be able to be independent, live a fully actualized life and all that, I wouldn't be thrilled with the decision, but I would allow for the parents to make that decision if they so chose. This is a sloppy and it's a messy one. And at the end, I think the last sentence in the chapter is, now that you all hate me, let's continue. And of course, by the way, this is where the conservatives, who I think are mostly going to really love this book, because I offer a lot of defense for a lot of their values, even the ones that I don't share. I think this is the one that's going to be very hard for them to swallow. But I think in a society, as I say, between of 320 million some odd people, you can veer on the side of the individual who is here, who is protected by the rights given to them or protected by the government. And then at some point, you have to have a sensible cutoff. And you're pro-choice, right?
Yep, and that was the right answer. So we can move on to the next round. Because you agree with me, you got that one right. No,
I'm glad I got one.
I mean, what you've articulated is the problem, the difference between science and the law. The law has to draw the line somewhere because we have to have rules and laws. And so if the line is here, then after that, it's illegal. Before it's legal, whatever. And in science, it's a continuum. There is no place to draw the line. I mean, the conception is a big jump, but it's still just, a zygote. It's just tiny. And the blastocyst and so on, you can't possibly equate that with an adult woman who is a citizen, has rights and so on. Anyway, that's the problem with that. I'm sympathetic to both sides. I am pro-choice. I think it's, mostly single poor women that don't have very many options. I definitely see why it's a hardness of life, not hardness of heart, as a famous paper put it. This is actually a paper on infanticide. Because before modern abortion technologies came online and then modern birth controls, women just killed their babies after birth instead of before. And it was, fairly rampant in the 19th century, say in Europe and America, the trash can babies phenomenon. And so in a way, it's going to happen one way or the other, not because women like killing babies or Democrats or atheists or anything like that. It's hardness of life. And you referenced that, what are we going to do after we tell them you have to have the baby? Are you going to provide some support? Now, to be fair, Christian churches say, yeah, we will, help. But of course, that comes with with some extra baggage. You got to join the church or whatever. Anyway, it's a complicated one. Let's go to foreign policy. So the classical liberal one, I know this is also another one of these naughty ones, that we should just mind our own business. But on the other hand, we live in a global world where there's people that need help. Don't we have a moral obligation to help, the Rwandans during the genocide or whoever?
Yeah. So look, I believe in something that Ronald Reagan believed in, which is peace through strength. There seems to be this idea here that if you're for the military, or if you believe that America is an exceptional nation or the last superpower, or that America has a role because we've actually done something unprecedented, which is welcome everybody into our borders to become a greater nation. I mean, the whole melting pot idea that, by the way, is still working, right? I mean, I say this many times in the book, people don't leave America. No, the only people who leave America actually are the billionaires who move to the Cayman Islands, and they usually don't even move. They put the money in the Cayman Islands and they go to New Zealand or something like that. But I do believe America, as the last remaining superpower, has a moral responsibility. Now, that being said, and I address this, we've made many blunders. There is no doubt the Iraq War was a blunder. Although I've had our friend Faisal Saeed al-Mutar, who's an Iraqi refugee, actually make a pretty cogent argument for the Iraq War. And Saddam killed several members of his family. But I do believe that we have gotten ourselves into many intractable things. We're still at war in Afghanistan right now. It's the longest war in American history. Nobody knows why we're there anymore. I mean, nobody knows why. But we continue these things. But what I would say is that I am for a strong military and a strong America so that we do not have to go to war. Now, what's interesting about this is that in 2020, the idea of us getting into a true sort of old school military conflict, I mean, boots on the ground, tanks and planes and everything else, that's almost unfathomable for us right now. We're fighting different wars now. We're fighting wars with ISIS. We're fighting wars with guerrilla groups. We're fighting, wars against terrorist cells and things like that. That is very different than a traditional military action. But not only did, George W. Bush go in and topple Iraq, and now, is Iraq really a country right now? It's hard to say. But let's not forget, Barack Obama had a kinetic military action, a phrase that nobody had heard about before that he didn't get congressional authorization for. We toppled Gaddafi in Libya, and now Libya basically isn't a country anymore. And then we could get into Benghazi and the rest of it. But my basic belief is that we should have a strong military, not to use it, but to not use it, to tell people we're here to basically, we want Western democracies, right? Western democracies don't go to war with each other. Now, I'm not here to nation build either. I want to be very clear about that. I don't think we should be nation building. I think there are grassroots things we could be doing in countries to help not American, that would have been a terrible slip, but to help Western ideas and freedom and democracy take root. And by the way, we were doing that in Iraq. I mean, many people forget this, that whether you think we should have gone into Iraq or not, that when Obama took over, there were free and fair elections in Iraq, as free and fair as they could possibly be. And then we just sort of announced that we were leaving one day, and then, all the militias took over, right? So that's another one of these things. If we break it, do we have to fix it? I mean, these are all the conversations that we have to have. But I would say that the basic classical liberal approach would be peace through strength. We should not be going to wars all the time. And at the same time, when Bernie says, I want to cut our military by this amount, or it just doesn't mean anything, because it's like, what? There are bad guys out there. I do believe there are bad guys. There are bad actors. And you can't just say, I'm going to be nice all the time and expect that they're going to be nice. But what you can say is, I'm strong. And from that position of strength, let's talk. And actually, I think this is a place where it's hard for many people to admit, but I think this is a place where Trump has done pretty well. Whether you think we've accomplished anything in North Korea or not, we are talking. If Obama had done this, people would be loving it, right? The media would be loving it. We're talking to North Korea. And by the way, the right media would be hating it. Obama's talking to a dictator.
Right.
So, we all have those inconsistencies. But generally speaking, I don't think there's any reason to think that Trump wants to invade more countries. He's done very targeted strikes by killing Soleimani, the Iranian military leader. I think those types of things where we say to nations or to rogue groups, you can't just sow chaos all over the world because we will do something. I think that's a net good. And I think the bigger issue is that if we just said, the purely libertarian side of this, we're out, we're pulling everybody back. And sure, we could scale back certain things. We've got troops in Japan and Germany and all of these places, right? There's is it something like 80,000 troops in Germany, something like that? I don't know what the exact number is. But we have these troops everywhere. So if you said to me, okay, we're going to scale all that back by, say, 20%, something like that, I think there's probably a good argument to be had there, and we can use the money elsewhere. But the simple fact is, that the entire world, this is the dirty secret that the world doesn't want everybody to know. They want American leadership. The world wants American leadership. And when there isn't American leadership, look what happens. So look at NATO. I mean, NATO was signed to make sure that if you're in NATO and you're attacked, you're going to be protected by NATO. But what was it? It was that if you're attacked, the United States is going to do something. Right. Because if the UK was attacked, do you think France is going to do anything? Of course not. I mean, we have history that will not happen, right? There was that World War II thing. So all of it seems to fall back on us, whether we like it or not. And we could have a really great discussion for hours and hours about how do you extricate yourself from that situation if ultimately it's just too much responsibility on one nation. But I think by going into less things, by being strong, that's really how you ensure some level of security. I think that's basically what I would say is a classical liberal approach. And Thomas Jefferson wrote about that we don't want to be all over the place solving the world's problems.
There's a famous story where James Baker, Secretary of State James Baker under Ronald Reagan, told Margaret Thatcher, Ronald wants to get rid of nuclear weapons. And she slapped him with her handbag. She handbagged him, which is, I guess, one of her famous things she would do to people she didn't agree with, because she argued deterrence. It works. And, here we are, more than 75 years after the last time a nuclear weapon was used, and it has not been used since in war.
Well, that's why I mentioned the Obama's red line in Syria.
Yeah.
Because he said if Assad uses chemical weapons, then that's a game changer and we're going to do something. And then we know Assad did use chemical weapons. Yeah. Now, you can find videos of me when I was on the Young Turks and I was a big lefty when the original ISIS chaos started happening in Syria. And I was saying no American involvement. We've got to stay out sometimes. Turkey can get involved. Saudi Arabia can get involved. Maybe we can do a humanitarian corridor just to get people out of the direct path of ISIS, but no military whatsoever. But once Obama set that red line, if you don't react once that red line is crossed, it's not just that you've emboldened your enemies, but then your allies, whoever they are.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're going, whoa, can we trust this guy anymore? Can we trust this country anymore? And again, this is where I think Trump actually has done a good job in reinstilling some of this stuff. So remember, right when he became president, wasn't it only a few weeks or a few months later, he dropped the mother of all bombs? Remember that? And it was like, and everyone thought he's starting World War III. But it was really like, oh, he was just saying to the world, hey, I'm here. You don't know what I'm going to do. And don't mess with us. And I think that is, it's sort of a little bit of Wild West. And you can argue whether Trump's the best guy to be in charge of all this or not. I mean, that's a whole different thing. But I think that the basic idea of peace through strength and deterrence is the right idea.
Yeah, there is this idea that he's adopting Nixon's madman strategy that is leaked to the Chinese that I might just be crazy enough to use weapons, even though I'm not.
Yeah, it's like who knows what he's gonna do.
And the underlying theory behind all this is a game theoretic model of the other guy problem. It's the Hobbesian trap or the security dilemma. Even if all of us were rational, calculating moral beings, the fact that some other guy may not be, and I don't know for sure what's in his heart, I got to keep my defenses up. We're a long ways from that, that sort of global, porous political borders, porous economic borders, and that my favorite scene from A Few Good Men, when Jack Nicholson is schooling Tom Cruise, the you can't handle the truth. What's the truth?
Yep.
We live in a world with walls, and on those walls are men with guns. And, you got to hold you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. And he gives that whole speech that really is a kind of that was written to be a kind of a parody of a conservative position. But in fact, it's true.
It's quite true. I mean, that's also why, Republicans, I talk about this a little in the book also, these sort of factory settings that we all have. If you grow up in America and the West in general, it's sort of like, oh, Democrats are nice and care about poor people and minorities. Republicans care about war and money and blah, blah, blah. But of course, it's not as 2D as that. And I think it's Colonel Jessup, I think is the name of the character, right?
Yeah.
And you can't handle the truth, meaning there are hard truths to defend lives, to defend institutions, to defend values and beliefs. And the idea of America, which is the most incredible idea that we have been able to do this, to defend that, it's going to take some messiness. So I think this is where when you just come in with rainbows and hope and change and the government can do everything, we can solve all your problems, that's just for people that don't really think about things very hard. And then, you get, unfortunately, the counter to that is you get people that kind of sound mean, which doesn't feel very good, but those might be the people that keep you safe.
What's the classical liberal position on guns? Another one of these hard problems. Most people don't want to, cancel the Second Amendment and confiscate everybody's guns. And as you note in the book, homicides have declined, probably for a bunch of other reasons not related to gun control laws one way or the other. But still, there's something like 300 million guns in America. 35,000 or so people die of guns, about half by suicide. Not the same number as people that die by automobiles. Where's other industrialized advanced nations don't have the gun problems because they don't have guns. We're not going to get rid of all those guns. What's the solution to this problem if there is one?
So, well, first off, the amount of guns we have in this country, I actually do believe is a problem. There are so many weapons here. It's virtually crazy. I mean, if there are in fact 350 million guns in America, that's basically the equivalent of how many people we have here, potentially even more. That's an awful lot of weapons. That being said, they are here, and for the most part, they are legally here, right? Most of the people, I mean, the NRA people, you can attack the NRA all day long. NRA people aren't the ones shooting up things. They are getting their guns legally and the rest of it. So I think there's one level of it where you can just talk about the amount of weapons and whether that's good or not. Sure. But can we take those things back? I would be more worried about the government overreach of doing that. That's one thing. The second thing, of course, is that the places where we have the highest, most strict gun laws, and Chicago is the best example of this, have the highest rate of gun crime. And the reason that it's so impossible to talk about that is because suddenly that becomes racist to talk about. Right. Because we know it's a lot of gang-related crime. It's a lot of black-on-black crime in Chicago. And, a guy like Sean Hannity, who it's weird for me to kind of quote a guy here, but he's one of the few people that publicly talks about this all the time. He'll say, well, if we're going to have the conversation about guns, why aren't we allowed to talk about the place in America where gun violence is the worst, the fact that it has the strictest gun laws, and of course, because it becomes about race and then nobody wants to touch the issue. What I would say is I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I absolutely believe you have the right to defend yourselves. I'm very upfront about this in the book. This is not one of my pet issues per se. I don't really, I'm not someone that's a hunter or something like that. So I'm not really out there with guns all the time. But especially now, in a time like we're living in right now with coronavirus and all being in our homes and feeling like society is really at this very strange tipping point where anything could happen. Wouldn't you want to be able to defend yourself? I mean, one of the reasons, I just got a new dog the day that the shelters closed in LA. I ran and we weren't ready to get a dog yet because our last dog had just died at 16 years old. And I thought I was going to be on tour right now also.
All right.
So I wasn't even going to be home. So we didn't want to get a dog yet. We wanted to wait a little bit. But then I saw the shelters were closing. I ran there and I wanted to save the dog. And Clyde was about to be put down and I saved him. And that's great. But it was also part of me was thinking, if society gets really weird right now, having a dog in your house is another way to have protection. There's a statistic. It's something like you have a 90% less chance of having your house broken into simply if you have a dog.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
okay,
because
good.
if someone's scouting your house and they go, well, that house has a dog, the next house over doesn't have a dog, you're going to go to the next house over, because why
Right.
why have to deal with the barking, potentially getting bit, and the litany of
Right.
other things?
Right.
So we absolutely have a right to protect ourselves. We have tremendous laws to stop bad people from getting guns, but the thing is, bad people don't follow laws. So what I would much rather focus on is the mental health issues. I would rather focus on the glorification of weapons and our human obsession with violence, things like that. I think the mental health one really is the key one. And the simplest way to say that would be that if I was handed a machine gun, I would not walk into a mosque or a temple or a church or a school or anywhere else and shoot people. A crazy person, a person with mental health problems, could potentially do that.
Yeah.
So again, the weapon, we can whittle down every little, this chamber and this amount of this and that. And again, I'm just not that interested in that. There are better experts on that. And the way I lay out this whole chapter that we're going through, all of these topics in and of themselves, there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of books written on them as whole books. So I'm trying to give these things in, 5-6 pages each. You have a right to defend yourself. We have a lot of laws. The idea of a buyback, it doesn't really make sense, because buyback, well, the government didn't give you the gun in the first place, so that's not really buying it back. That's something else.
Right.
I am also worried that the more power we give to the government to just take things from people, well, okay, so let's say we whittled the Second Amendment down a little bit. Well, what comes after that? Then that First Amendment one, the one that we really care about, that free speech one that I'm much better well-versed in to talk about, that becomes a problem too. So that's my basic premise on it.
And where do you put capital punishment in all this?
I didn't put capital punishment. I think I cut that. I had to decide how many things I wanted in there. It was one of the things that I got. You know this, and then I got into it with my editor. So I am not for capital punishment. And again, this is where, if you took a lot of my beliefs, I'm against the death penalty. I'm obviously for gay marriage. I'm pro-choice.
Yeah.
I'm for some level of public education, even though I'm really for school choice. I mean, these are things that should make me a Democrat, right? But unfortunately, I'm only getting hate from these people, and I'm getting a lot of love from the other side. It's just one of those strange things. But I don't like the idea that the easiest way to do it in 30 seconds, I don't like the idea of giving the state extra power to kill people. Now, we can have a conversation about whether keeping people on death row, we know that this costs more money actually than to incarcerate someone for their whole life because of all the legal things and everything else. I just don't want to give the state more power in that regard. I've heard interesting arguments from Dennis Prager about why the state should be able to put people to death if they've committed murder. I'm just not there. And this is where I just want to hold that back a little bit.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. That giving the state that much power over life is a little risky, particularly since the Innocence Project has shown with DNA testing that quite a few of these people, that were let off were innocent, and that probably means some percentage of them were executed unjustly.
Of course.
So,
And look, it's not that life imprisonment is so great either, but I guess there's a chance that over time you might be proven to be innocent. So it's just one of those ones. It's like I can understand the knee-jerk response the other way.
Oh, totally. Totally sympathetic with the family's victims who want to fry this guy. I mean, if somebody killed a member of my family like that, I'd want to strap him to old Sparky and throw the switch myself. But personally, that's why we have laws. That is not just up to me. We have to have some set of standards here that we have to get around our emotional responses like that. Remember when Michael Dukakis was asked that about the death penalty, and he gave that lame answer.
About they were looking for.
If your wife was raped and killed, would you want to fry this guy? The correct answer is hell yes. I want to fry the motherfucker. But that's why we have to have laws against that, because otherwise we're not a nation of.
We have to protect ourselves.
Right.
That's the point.
Yeah. Anyway, so we've been going for well over an hour. I want to be mindful of your time, and I want to get to the end of the book, which was kind of the inspirational part where you talk about finding a mentor, and then you actually offer what I'm calling Rubin's rules. You should have called them Rubin's rules.
I should have called them Rubin's rules.
I like those.
People get a lot of rules these days,
Well, and if anything, now's a particularly good time for this kind of advice, because we're all stuck in our homes. What should I do to get through this next month? So, but start with finding a mentor and who your mentors have been and why that's important.
Yeah, sure. So, I wrote the chapter it's about Jordan specifically because I toured with Jordan Peterson for a year and a half. We did about 120 shows in about 20 countries. It was truly the most incredible professional experience of my life. I mean, you know this well. And by the way, when I get to interview you next week for your book, the blurb that Jordan writes on the back of your book is exactly what Jordan is, because you have a part in your book where you're basically dissecting Jordan. And he then decides not only is he going to blurb your book, but admit sort of, I have a difference of opinion with this Shermer guy, but you should still read this book. And that right there, I mean, the second I saw it, when they sent us the copy, I thought, that's it. That's what Jordan is. And what I saw this man do consistently every night, and no matter where we were, it wasn't just these talks that I think you went to, I think at least two of them.
I've been to two of them, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't just the talks that he gave, where every night I could see him. He never gave the same speech twice. He would give an hour-and-a-half lecture, never the same speech twice. Sometimes he would talk about all 12 rules, sometimes one rule. Sometimes he would just talk about the media the whole time, or if he got into a fight with the New York Times writer. I mean, it was just sort of whatever he felt he could do that night. But what I saw more importantly than what he did on any given night was that he filled auditoriums of thousands of people all over the world that just wanted to take a little control of their life back, that for whatever reason fell into what he describes as the chaos, and he wanted to give them a little bit of order. And those 12 rules, from stand up straight with your shoulders back to all the rest of them, know that somebody across from you might know a little bit more than you.
Clean your room.
And clean your room and the rest of it, right? For whatever reason, something has been lacking, and I think it has something to do with internet culture and the way we're all so inundated with so much information, and maybe partially the breakdown of the family. That's a little more of a conservative part of this. He was helping people, and I saw it in real time. I saw after a show I think we did in Dublin, hours after the show, after all the meet and greets and the autographs and everything, we walk out, and most of these theaters, the artist entrance is on the side, so you don't have to walk out to everybody in the front. We walk out, and we're in a little alley, and we see two guys. One of them looks about 60, the other one's about 25, and they're crying and hugging, and they came to us very quickly. And it turned out that it was a father and son who hadn't seen each other in something like 8 years because they had a falling out, and that they, by coincidence, were at the show, and they reconnected there.
Whoa.
And I thought, how much more powerful could something be than this sort of thing? I saw, that we had a running joke throughout the show that Jordan started wearing these very fancy 3-piece suits, and that people in the audience would start dressing better. And you could see that they were getting better haircuts and all of these things. Well, I'll give you one more. We were in Stockholm, and I stopped at H&M, which is the, it's from Sweden. And I just needed a cap, actually, I needed a hat because it was a windy day. I go in there, I grab a cap, and I'm standing behind the line, and the guy in front of me says to the cashier, he says, in English, he says, "I'm buying my first suit tonight. I'm going to see Jordan Peterson." The cashier says, "I'm going to see Jordan Peterson tonight." And then I tapped him on the shoulder and I said hi, and they both knew who I was. And I thought, how incredible is this? Here's a 21-year-old kid who's buying his first suit so he can listen to a lecture by a psychologist from the tundra of Western Canada, a Harvard professor. Just tell them to just get their life in order. So I think, I don't even know that Jordan would, we never set this off that he was going to become my mentor in any way or something. But the lessons that I learned just by watching this guy, I've really incorporated into my life. I am by no means perfect. I don't always stand up straight with my shoulders back. But I think.
And you don't have a cat.
and I don't have a cat. I'm highly allergic to cats, as I say in the book. But I think that I've been able to take as many of those things and incorporate them into my life and try to put the best self that I have out there. And I think that was the purpose of the book. And I think often we need people to model it for us.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the amount of times that we've spoken publicly, you're one of the people that I go, that's what a clean thinker is. This is a decent guy. Like, we've been out to dinner and hung out and had drinks. Like, this is somebody that is putting something good in the world. And I think we all need some version of that. And for whatever reason, with young men right now, say 15 to, it's really into their 40s. I mean, I saw people there in their 70s, by the way. We saw a group of grandmothers. I mean, people would always say it's all these white, alt-right young men. Yeah. There was a grandmothers group that they play canasta together. There were like 8 grandmothers there. We saw trans people there and black people and gay people and the rest of it. And they were just trying to fix their life. And I think finding someone in your life that you can model some of that stuff after is deeply important.
I think that's why the self-help movement has always been fairly successful. going back to Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill, and the other Dale Carnegie, and now Tony Robbins, and so on. When you watch these guys, a lot of it sounds pretty anodyne, like self-help 101. I mean, duh. Set goals, make your get dressed, take a shower, shave, get a job, and so on. But I guess a lot of people just never get that for whatever reason. But that's not what I want to ask. What's wrong with those kinds of super simple principles that the left or liberals or whoever is so critical of Jordan? Why is he so hated?
There's so much there. I mean, I think the simplest way of explaining it is that if you believe that the state is supposed to do everything, then what do you really fear? If the state can solve all of your problems, if we could just figure out a way to rejigger the entire system so that we'd all behave properly, what would you fear? You would fear the thing that Ayn Rand feared. You would fear, or that she didn't fear the individual. You would fear the thing that Ayn Rand lived for the most, which is the individual. And that's really what Jordan was and is always talking about, that the individual is the answer, that if you believe in the collective, you will always crush the individual. But for you, Michael Shermer, or me, Dave Rubin, or anyone listening to this, you know how to live your life better than I could ever tell you how to live it. That is the exchange that we have to have in a free society. You might do some stuff that I'm not that thrilled with, and I might do some stuff that you're not that thrilled with. And this is where one of those examples where people will say to me, Rubin, how can you be friends with Ben Shapiro? He thinks your marriage is a sin. Now, first off, Ben is not trying to stop my marriage in any way. Perhaps conservatives should have taken a more libertarian approach for years and said gay marriage is okay. That would have been nice. They missed the boat, but it's not like the liberals were fighting for it either, as you pointed out earlier, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. But I can accept that someone's allowed to have a belief system that is counter to mine as long as they don't infringe on my rights. What Jordan, I think, basically put out there was, it's your life. Figure out how to live it the best way you can. Be responsible. Don't just, he would say this thing about, you may hate your job. I know a lot of people hate their jobs, right? Well, if you hate your job, what would be the responsible thing to do? It's not just quit tomorrow and then pray that something's going to happen. It's, okay, I got to look at my finances. I got to go, okay, do I have a kid? Do I have a car? Do I have a dog? Do I have mortgage payments? All of these things. And then I can lay out a path as I'm sending out resumes so that 3 months from now, I have a new job. I have a new career, whatever it is. But I think we've all sort of fallen into a trap, especially younger people, the internet generation of, I feel this way, I have to have it now, or the whole damn system has to burn down. And I think he really was, the book is an antidote to chaos. I think he was an antidote to that. And then on top of everything else, and I know you know this, the hit pieces, if you ask why the media hates him so much, I mean, when you start doing something good and you start saying something true, there's a lot of clicks in it by attacking you. There's a lot of attention that you're going to get. There were former colleagues of his that, he had helped. I don't know that he ever talked about it publicly, that suddenly would turn against him, and all sorts of stuff like that. And, that was all sort of depressing and everything else, but it's worth it to fight for what you believe in.
Perfect place to end this conversation, Dave Rubin. I would advise people, don't burn this book. Just read this book called Don't Burn This Book. Actually, I'm
okay with a couple of people burning it. You know what I mean? It'll be good for social media.
That's right. It would be good for media coverage. Actually, I've met a lot of your fans who I think you are a mentor to a lot of them. So this book will be, I think, the next step, sort of the sequel to the 12 Rules for Life. Let's call it subliminally Dave Rubin's Rules.
Shermer, I got to give you one more plug here because I'm used to doing this the other way, where I say nice things about the guest, but the one part of the book that you didn't mention is when we went to Arizona State University, and we get into this exchange with a self-proclaimed Nazi, and the whole audience was freaking out. And I said, you know what? If you just listen to our talk, we'll gladly take your question first. And then it turned out that this happened to be a trans Nazi, which is just an odd little piece of the puzzle. But she had all sorts of questions, related to Auschwitz and the doors on the gas chambers and all these conspiracy theory stuff. And it was a seminal moment for me because you're an expert in this. You debunk these guys. And not only did you do it decently and respectfully, but everyone in that room saw us respect free speech, treat another human equally, whether their ideas were equal or not. And nobody was convinced by her arguments, but they were the things that they knew to be true were furthered by your coherent argument. And I think that really, over the last couple of years, for all the public events that I did, watching you do that, I thought this really is the best way. We all talk about sunlight is the best disinfectant, but this really is the best way to do it. We could have shouted her down. We could have made fun of her. Oh, you're a Nazi. I mean, I could have gone through the playlist of jokes. But we did it right. And I think if you do that, that's what I'm talking about the modeling thing. So I'm glad to be in this fight with you.
Oh,
my friend.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for saying that. And no, I love the book and I hope it does really well. Now's a perfect time to consume this content while we're all quarantined.
Well, thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for doing the show.